Hello, my name is Daniel Grimmer. This is part 2 of my talk on evolutionary epistemology in Silico. I'm going to be talking about neural networks and what they can teach us about nature and nurture. In particular, we're now talking about meta-learning and how I can give it an evolutionary interpretation. These are some results from a paper that I'll have a link to in the description. But first, let me talk about meta-learning without any evolutionary gloss. So here is a small toy diagram of training a neural network. Now, neural networks have many tunable parameters in them, indicated theta. So we've got theta A and theta B here, but in general, there's many more. And it's moving in some kind of loss landscape. So there's some objective function here, L of theta, that we are trying to generally minimize, but for my notation, it's better to maximize it. So it's something we're trying to maximize, a performance we're trying to get better at. And you gradually make little stochastic gradient steps in that direction, taking all these little red steps towards eventually arriving at the optimal state here, marked by a star. Now there are other tasks I'll show in a bit, and they've got their own optima, which I've marked with stars there. But you can assess then, after this single training run, you might want to do a second training run, and you might want it to go better than the first one. So what you can do is define a meta objective, which in this case I've taken to be the sum over n of the performance at every step. So this is basically the area under the performance curve, or the integral of it. It's called the MAML++ meta objective, model agnostic meta learning. You can look that up. But we assess the quality of this whole learning trajectory, which in some way depends upon theta 0, the initialization, where we started, right? And you can think, what direction would it be best to move theta 0 in order to increase that meta objective? Now, you could also change aspects of the learning algorithm or of the architecture. That's a more general kind of meta learning. But for simplicity here, let's focus on just learning the initial state. So the yellow arrow points in the direction it would be better to have started in to be better at training towards task A. You can mathematically compute that. And I have. This is all actual computations for this example. Now, in the second training run, though, we switch up what the task is. So now the task to be learned is task B, which is like task A, but different. And so we take our little steps along the training run to get there, these little green dots. But again, you can assess the quality of the overall learning trajectory and say, what direction would it have been better to start in if I was training towards task B again? And you take a step in that direction. Now you can repeatedly do this, cycling between all the tasks. And if you add up all the little meta gradients and adjust the initialization over time, it gets pulled very consistently into this centroid, this middle region between all of the trained states, because then it can quickly learn up to any of them. Of course, you could start at one of them, but then you'd have a difficult time learning the others. So some kind of compromise, you start off somewhere nearby where you can easily train to all the states you might need to train to. This is a standard example of meta learning. Now, I'm claiming this has some kind of evolutionary interpretation. Let me talk then quickly about a biological kind of meta learning, and then we'll see if they're the same. And indeed, there's a formal equivalence between them that I've proved in a recent paper that I'll give a link to in a moment. But let's think about biological meta-learning. So consider a species of bird that we're going to be thinking about throughout the talk, where each generation rolls a dice and gets a new random variable lambda. And that indicates being born into a different environment, a desert or a city or Antarctica or the jungle, And those environments have different kinds of predators in them, so snakes and cars and all different kinds of things. Or to keep with the linguistics example, which I'm going to be working with more later, think of early humans who have to learn a new language every few generations. Every 500 years, I can't understand Shakespearean English that well, right? And so languages shift and adapt over time. And sometimes dramatically, a conquering tribe moves in and now everyone has to speak a new language. So the baby bird, or the infant in that case, can't immediately know its generation's predators or language. There's no way to anticipate that in advance. And so some kind of lifetime learning is required. Which, by the way, that's just what we saw here. These different tasks that we had to train to. You can't start at located at high performance for all of them simultaneously. They're just too varied, right? So you have to just start off nearby, and some kind of language or in-life adaptation is necessary in each case. But the bird who can more quickly learn to identify its generation set of predators will do better at evading those predators and will have a clear survival advantage. We can quantify this with a numerical fitness score that I'm going to quantify a bit later on. So over generations, those who do better at quickly learning fitness-enhancing skills will be selected for. This is essentially tautological by what I mean by fitness, right? So the species will, as a whole, thereby learn how to learn. And this is meta-learning. It's learning how to learn. But is that biological meta-learning process that I just described really meta-learning in the same sense as the machine learning kind I just showed a moment ago? That's what's worked out in this paper, Grimmer 2026. Here's the Phil Tsai archive link and the first portion, at least, of the title, Evolutionary Meta-Learning in Neural Networks. If you look that up, you'll find it. But I say yes. Yes, there's actually a formal equivalence, if you look at it correctly, between the meta-learning that I just showed in the machine learning sense and the biological gloss that I just sketched for you. How does that work? We're going to go through a bit of mathematics here, but the talk overall is not too mathematically dense. So the model organism I consider has asexual reproduction, and it has a continuous genotype, which again could determine the initialization and different aspects of the learning algorithm and the architecture. Right? It could determine quite a lot of things, this genotype. But for simplicity, I'm just going to take it to be basically identical or in one-to-one correspondence with the initialization theta 0. That's again just for simplicity. We start off with a population, right? So it's a population evolution model. P, G of theta. G marks the generation. So G up to G plus 1 is how we're trying to make this motion. Now, there's a little Gaussian, think of it as a Gaussian. It's a little cloud of probability, and these individuals do better, and these individuals do worse. And so in the next generation, these ones are more represented and these are less, right? So this fitness multiplier says who has twice as many kids, who has half as many, basically. But you can see how that shifts the distribution a bit. And then there are some random mutations added on through a kind of convolution process. But selection and mutation together give us PG plus 1, the probability distribution for the next generation of initializations. Now, in the paper, I worked this out. If you put a Gaussian distribution into this process, you get a Gaussian distribution out, approximately. And I work out the conditions under which that's a good approximation in the paper. But what it means, essentially, is that we have this little Gaussian cloud moving and staying Gaussian over time. And Gaussians are determined by their means and all their covariances, so just which direction the cloud is squished in. Now, how do the mean and covariance update from generation to generation? Again, you can work this out analytically. You can see that the change in the initialization, the average initialization, the center of the cloud, changes. It moves in this direction, the gradient of the logarithm of the fitness function. So as I said, those who are more fit get enhanced, less fit get diminished, and that moves it in the direction that most increases the fitness, modified by the variance of the population. There has to be variance to select upon. This is all a kind of very Fisherian model of mass selection and selection acting upon variance. And then the variance itself changes from generation to generation. In effect, it just increases a bit because of the mutations. And then there's these other two terms, beta and psi here. They're little complications to balance things out, but it's all derived from a completely biologically faithful simulation of evolution. But what this shows is that the evolutionary dynamics in this asexual continuous genotype case, at least, is formally equivalent to a noisy stochastic gradient ascent up the log fitness landscape. So this little cloud we're watching, it will shift and move and shift and move, and it will sort of randomly walk up the fitness environment based on the logarithm of the fitness. But remember, there's this little index lambda here, which changes every time. So this is the outer loop of the simulations that I just showed here. And here is the the task changing every generation, right? So we train the different tasks every generation, just like the bird has different environments that it has to face every generation. So this is really an exact formal equivalence. But what is this fitness function? Let me quantify it now. So again, let's think of our bird that has to identify a new set of predators every generation, snakes and then cars, etc. They're going to have some fitness quality that we can quantify. Here's the simple model that I put forward. And again, I work it out in much more detail in the paper. But a childhood, think of it as N, 100 say, predator identification tasks, followed by a single opportunity for reproduction. So every day a predator walks up to the flock, and those who haven't clocked where the predator is have a chance of dying. All those who spotted the predator get away, 100% success on a correct prediction, but a chance of death on a failed prediction. Let's suppose there's an epsilon chance of instant death, say 10% or something. Now then there's a 90% chance of surviving any failure. And what's the odds that you survive your entire childhood? Well, it's the number of times you failed, 1 minus epsilon, multiplied together that many times. So intuitively, evolution wants to maximize fitness, which again is what we showed that the outer loop does. And to do that, you need to minimize the number of failures to minimize the chances of death. This is a cost of learning, right? But again, technically we care about the logarithm of fitness. And if you take the logarithm of that, you get the logarithm of the probability of survival, which is just the number of failures times this factor for the density, or the danger of each failure, sorry. So we want to minimize the number of failures, and that's straight in a linear way. That is what the log fitness is, to be minimized. Here is a plot to demonstrate or to work out some things visually of a slow learner and a fast learner. So obviously the slow learner is going to have a lower fitness because they fail more and therefore have more chances of death. To the right on these diagrams is time within each individual's life. This is one individual, a slow learner in its lifetime through its childhood, and then a fast learner in comparison. The black dots at the bottom are failures, and the black dots at the top are successes. And you can see that both learners gradually transition from failures to successes throughout their life. I've showed in red here the moving average. This jagged line that tends to go up is the moving average. If you work out some calculus, the red shaded area above the moving average is the number of failures, and the blue shaded area below is the number of successes. Now let's think about what that means. To maximize the log fitness, again, we wanted to minimize the number of failures via that linear correspondence that I just showed. But this means maximizing the number of successes, because those add up to a constant. But this means maximizing the area underneath the learning curve, this sum over n of L theta n. It's a little bit blocked there, but you can see it. So that's the area under the curve. But that's just the MAML++, the model agnostic meta-learning fancy gadget that I mentioned earlier. So that's why I picked this as our meta objective, because it is the logarithm of fitness. And remember, evolution moves us each generation in the direction of the gradient of that. So these meta gradients here are the direction that natural or Darwinian selection sort of biases us towards, just because of the survival and failures of the little population cloud which is around here. So to say that clearly, think of a population cloud around this initialization. Those who learn a bit faster will do better and have higher fitness, and others will have less fitness. And so this little Gaussian shifts into another Gaussian. The direction of that shift and the magnitude of it is given by this little meta-gradient step that we're about to take. So in the next generation, the population starts off here because there was some selection applied to where it had started previously. We have a little selection towards being better at learning task A. And then we get a little selection towards being better at learning task B, and so on. And all these selection effects accumulate so that just by natural selection, this exact same meta-learning computation plays out on an evolutionary timescale to pull the initialization up into this space that's between an averaged of all of the well-trained states. And it sort of hovers around in that region. This is exact kind of meta-learning evolutionary simulation, which we've done in this little toy example. Now, if you know much about evolutionary biology, you are probably thinking of the Baldwin effect at the moment, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. Let me describe it, or let me have Dennett describe it. A practice that is both learnable with effort and highly advantageous once learned can become more and more easily learned. And it can gradually move from the status of not needing to be learned at all. Organisms that are closer in the adaptive landscape to the discovery will have a clear advantage over those that are more distant. Let's go back and look at these diagrams again and notice that in each case, the metagradient, and this is particular to this example, I'll show another example later that doesn't have this character, but each time the metagradient was pointed from theta 0 up directly to theta n, the well-trained state. So theta n minus theta 0, that's this direction, this arrow pointing there. So we take a step in that direction towards the final state, towards the final state, towards the final state. And eventually we end up here being pulled at each generation towards the final states, but they now cancel out because they're in opposite directions. That's why we're attracted to this center region. So this is exactly the Baldwin effect, that we are being pulled also kind of along the learning trajectory. Notice that we move up and right because that's the direction learning was headed in. So again, as Dennett said, those who start off a bit along the learning trajectory, who have already, just by random Darwinian chance, by random mutation, have taken the first step along the learning curve, well, they have less learning to do. And this is why they are benefited. Because when we come back around to the red task, again, now those who have started in this direction have a bit more of a benefit. Okay. What does that look like formally? We don't have to dig into all this mathematics. I just want to point out that if you take the logarithm of the fitness function to be this sum over the loss function that I motivated in the last few slides, and you compute exactly, no approximations, what is the gradient step? What direction does theta 0 move in? You can isolate inside of it this theta n minus theta 0 term. It's called the reptile update. They named it after an animal in a completely independent context. So it's not a biological derivation that gave this. It was just an engineering heuristic. But here I've made an explicit connection to the Baldwin effect. So we have this kind of reptile update, which is pulling the initialization towards the final step. But that's not all that's going on, because there's this whole other term here, which is in a way path dependent in a complicated way. This one just depended on the start and the end point. That fixed it, right? But this depends on the shape of the path and the environment you're going through and the curvature of it. It's quite a more complicated term. But I can interpret this as well as giving another important biological effect called canalization. So what is the concept of canalization? It came from Waddington in the I think he started in the 1940s, but he published the big results in the 1950s on it. And he was thinking about developmental biology and the evolutionary process of this. So how does a fetus move through the developmental landscape to a kind of fixed, regimented final state, but also with a guided kind of developmental path that this happens and then that happens and then the fingers grow and then we have the webbing between our toes and then we lose it. And there's all these sequence of events that have to happen in a very organized, orchestrated thing. It's very hard to see how evolution could produce such a harmonious kind of symphony, which is robust against all kinds of variations. Like the genes could be different, the temperature could be different salinity, like pregnancy is a chaotic process. Like how does the baby come out of it reliably in a developmentally stable way? Obviously, there's evolutionary benefits to having that kind of stabilization and guidance through this very delicate process. So Waddington comes up with this metaphor of canalization, which is that there are canals carved into the developmental landscape, a kind of abstract space in which the fetus develops. The fetus is here represented by this ball at the top of figure A, and it's supposed to roll down the hill, guided and shepherded by these developmental pathways, literally canals in the landscape. And it reaches certain choice points where the heart has to move left or move right or something along these lines. underneath the landscape is a system of pulleys and guide wires to kind of control the shape of the landscape by fixing it down into the genes. And there's another kind of stability here. If you cut some of these cords or change the genes in some way, it's a sort of multi-supported structure. So if you make one little change, it doesn't disrupt the whole thing, or it shouldn't. So it tries to stabilize itself both genetically and environmentally. And these are important ideas about developmental canalization. So this is a very important concept in evolutionary biology and in developmental biology as well. Now, this is important, as will come later in the next portion of the talk, to talk about linguistics and Chomsky's theory of language, which, to spoil things, I think you can get a universal grammar inside of a large language model. This is important for Chomsky because Chomsky says language development really ought to be called language growth, because the language organ grows like any other body organ, right? And I think he has something like this canalization in mind, that there's a kind of guided, shepherded developmental pathway of first we learn syntax and then we learn, SVO versus SOV language. And there's like a developmental pathway, very regimented and very scheduled, on which our language development happens. And we all come to basically the same kind of language competence at the end of the day, right? Just like babies come out of the womb, basically standardized, despite all their variances. So what happens if we put canals into our little evolutionary simulation that I've been showing? Because we can now interpret it as evolution. Here, we're being trained towards task A, but I've just carved out, just by fiat, kind of, suppose there was a canal in the fitness landscape. The meta gradient doesn't point towards the final state anymore, and it doesn't point towards the target state either. It's pointing off to the left, actually away from all the well-trained states. And that's because of this canalization effect. So the initialization doesn't just seek to be near to the final states, it actually seeks, by the second term I showed you, to be at the top of canals that lead to the final states, because that's a more reliable way to reach the final state, quicker as well. So we take a step to the left, in fact, and then we start training towards task B, which has its own canal, and task C has its own canal, and task D has its own canal. I set it up so that all of the canals, notice, are overlapping at 0, 0. So the 0, 0 point is on all 4 of the canals. So if you run the evolutionary simulation forward, the state continues to march to the left, actually away from all of the well-trained states, towards the place where all the canals meet up. So it really likes to start at the top of the canals to be then heading towards all of the good final states from this privileged kind of position at the top of the hill. Let's see, there we go. So that is how we can do meta-learning and give it an evolutionary interpretation. In the next portion of the talk, I will apply this kind of thinking to large language models and argue that we can really expect, and I'm working on this with a student, but we haven't got it quite yet, but really our expectation is that something very close to a Chomskyan universal grammar comes out of this kind of training process. Okay, thank you.